thank you very much, Heather, and welcome everybody. Good evening. I see we already have a fairly good crowd of you, and I know I think Heather was telling me even maybe a few more to join still. I'm delighted to see you all, and as Heather said, this is our second webinar in a law school webinar of the year, and we were just discussing that Heather and I have been doing these for perhaps 3 years now, and they're quite successful, and some of you may even been coming that long. I hope so, with a range of topics, and it gives the law school a good opportunity to share its research, its scholarship, its professional practice and experience with our alumni, our current students, and others. And again, we were discussing, this is perhaps a trailblazer. We were doing this before lockdown, before everybody and their dog were on Zoom and Teams and so forth. We were giving our podcast, so we're trailblazers in that sense. And then I'm hoping we're not victims of the commonplace of podcasts. And by looking at our audience tonight, I don't think we are. I know, because I think this is a really good thing that the law school has been doing. I guess I would say that I've been involved in it, but thank you for coming, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome my colleague in the law school, John Karlberg, this evening, to come and speak to us about the just transition. John has got an economics and modern history degree from the University of St. Andrews and a postgraduate degree from Aberdeen University in environmental science. He's joined RGU in 2008 after a career working around the world in various countries, and I'm sure that informs his perspective on the oil business, the energy business, and now moving on to the different aspects of the energy business around the world. He teaches in the law school at both postgraduate and undergraduate level on UK oil and gas law and renewable energy issues, and he also supervises several PhD students in the law school. So I'm delighted to have him here, and I think we're lucky to have John and his kind of degree and speak to us this evening about the just transition. So welcome, John. Thank you for coming. What I'll do now is I'm going to ask John some questions about the subject, and then we'll feed off that for the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. And then, as Heather said, if any questions do arise, then please do use the chat box and note them down. And Heather will pose them to John once we're done. So again, John, thank you very much. Our first question, an opener, good for me and everybody, I'm hoping. Well, what exactly is the just transition?
Okay, can you hear me, everyone? Can you hear me?
Yes, I think I can. Yes, John.
Okay, yeah, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Paul, for that glowing introduction. I'm getting more impressed with myself as we go on. But yeah, what is the just transition? The concept of a just transition, you could say, has really captured the zeitgeist or the public imagination, and that of policymakers, politicians, and a wide range of stakeholders over the last few years. It's been a kind of slow and steady build-up, but now it's quite a mainstream area of research for academics. And of course, as we will hear later in our talk today, many governments have embraced it big time, you might say, including the Scottish government, in fact. So what is it? It is really a process or a concept that societies have to struggle with to phase out environmentally destructive carbon-producing industries, while at the same time addressing the concerns of workers and communities which are impacted by this transition. And it calls for a wide agenda relating to social and economic changes, and the concept of environmental justice comes into it, as we will be hearing later on. Um, what's going to happen to a lot of, let's say, oil and gas related communities, including Aberdeen? What's going to be happening here is that there are definitely going to be job substitutions, job eliminations, job transformation, but there's also going to be job creation. And we can see that both the government and local institutions are really driving the role of Aberdeen to change from being an oil and gas producer to being a renewable energy producer. So that's something which is going on. But how do we define it? Paul is asking, what is it? Well, I think that we can say that there are two very different approaches to it. One we might call a very narrow approach, and one is a broader approach. The initial narrow approach, let's say, really began with US labor movements towards the 90s of last century, and partly in response to environmental movement, environmental concerns, which has always been strong in the US, in fact, since the 1960s, 1970s. Basically, the idea is that workers and communities, their livelihoods might be lost because of this shift away from fossil fuel related activities. And these communities should receive support from the state, which can take place, in a variety of ways. That's what we might call the narrow definition. A second or broader definition is related to what we might call environmental justice. And it's not just about workers in particular industries. It also embraces vulnerable groups. And some of these groups which have been impacted, quite negatively by the fossil fuel industry over the years. We can say that the fossil fuel industry has, over the years, over the past century, had many casualties. In actual fact, they run the full gamut from, for example, children getting asthma in parts of rural Australia, the execution of community leaders in Nigeria, Ken Saro-Wiwa, for example, in Ogoniland, damaged livelihoods of fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico post-Macondo, and a lot of the geopolitics which have happened in the last 20 years over oil and gas, getting access to oil and gas, including war. In fact, more, topical today, we might think that some ways Putin's invasion of Ukraine is related to this. In actual fact, Russia's oil and gas industry is really financing the current invasion of Ukraine. So those are some two definitions of the just transition: a narrow one and a broader one.
Thank you, John. You alluded to energy a few times in your definition. Would the concept of just transition be generally limited to the energy sector, or is it a broader concept applying, say, to manufacturing or indeed agriculture or other industries?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Paul. In actual fact, no, it's not limited to energy. It's basically limited to the entirety of societies. Everyone is going to be impacted by it. Every industry is going to be impacted by it. I mean, obvious examples are the shipping industry, the aviation industry, a wide range of manufacturing industries, the transport industry. Virtually every aspect of society is going to be impacted by the just transition. So we're not, I mean, my focus has been, in how, and when I teach on the energy industry, but your question is a good one. The just transition is going to affect every aspect of society.
I never really thought of that. I mean, obviously working in the higher education sector, obviously you have an impact in some way on education and or maybe not even just the heating of our state or the technology we use or indeed now our working practices, whether we would work at home more so in order to accommodate, lesser transport costs or whatever the facet may be. So very, very interesting. Thank you. I guess again, you alluded to this in your first answer. I from my reading and my lay understanding of this, it seems relatively new. Is this a new concept, or is this idea of, you mentioned maybe California in the 60s or 70s? Is this got antecedents? Is this a new concept, or is it more historical in nature?
I don't think we could call it a new concept, Paul. In fact, as you said, it has connections with the North American trade union movement going back 40 or 50 years. And trade unions have a large role to play, obviously, in representing stakeholders in the just transition. But it's been around for a long time. I mean, if you look back at the Cancun agreements of 2010 of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they already recognized that ensuring a just transition of the workforce that creates decent work and quality jobs within a paradigm shift to a low carbon economy. It's been at international level, it's been around for a long time. But I would say that in the last 5 years or so, since really the Paris Agreement, we're going to be looking at that in a moment, the 2015 Paris Agreement, but there has been acceleration of this concept.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And that brings me on to that question. And I guess in one sense, I was thinking of just transition being related to energy. Whether what are we going to do with after we stop relying on fossil fuels and indeed and how we manage those who suffer as a consequence, and or what locations or workforces or whatever, tax bases and so forth. And then you're telling me it's not just energy. And then I'm mentioning that the Paris Agreement, is this also related to climate change, or is there an impact, or does it have its perhaps a legal basis or within the Paris Agreement of 2015?
Yeah, I mean, the Paris Agreement was a milestone agreement as part of the UNFCCC, which is a legally binding international agreement within the convention itself. Everyone who has signed up to the agreement has got to adhere to a wide range of criteria and conditions. They have to submit NDCs, i.e. their own initiatives regarding what they're going to be doing, nationally determined contributions about how to deal with climate change. So of course, the energy transition is really all about climate change. It's driven by the UNFCCC, and that's really what is underpinning the whole debate: how to deal with climate change and how to, ensure that human civilization essentially is going to be able to move from fossil fuel based economies to zero carbon economies by 2050 and keep the temperature of global warming below an increase of 2% and ideally 1.5. degrees rather, sorry. So yeah, climate change is driving the whole agenda in actual fact.
Okay, yeah, well, that makes absolute sense, and indeed falls on from what we were speaking about in our last webinar with our colleague.
Yeah, it was closely connected, and if I'm not mistaken, it was touched on briefly towards the end of the last webinar.
Yeah, indeed, with our colleague Nicholas Molly and
So if we look, for example, at the Paris Agreement, that was hard to believe 7 years ago, but we can see that progressively the successive conference of parties, the COPs, Marrakesh and COP22 in Bonn in 23, in Poland in COP24, they've all been progressively addressing the issues related to the just transition. It's becoming more and more significant and more known and more understood, and governments are having to take much more cognizance of how to deal with it in their, in the forward-looking policies, let's say. So it's very much related to climate change. It's very much related to the Paris Agreement, and it's very linked to how societies have to change and how communities will be changing and are changing at the moment, in actual fact.
Okay, well, thank you. And I guess crucial in this change, I suppose, are the oil and gas companies themselves who are profiting, managing, doing the extracting and refining and so forth, and the transporting. And then, so I was wondering if you could tell us, like, what are the views? Are they, or would the oil and gas companies be reluctant? Would this be eating into their profits, say, or they think that they have to pay higher taxes, or otherwise? What if you could? What are the views, or is it possible even to generalize the views of oil and gas companies towards the just transition?
Well, I think the level of interest in the energy transition and what's known as ESG reporting, is placing a lot of pressure on oil and gas companies to change. They have a really difficult act to follow in view of the environmental impacts of fossil fuels that everyone knows about today. A lot of their shareholders are concerned about holding shares in these companies. A lot of them see no future in this industry. How can an industry which actually is a major carbon producer and emitter actually be said to be meeting decarbonization targets or goals? So they have really got to invent themselves over the next few years. And if you look at the websites of any of the big oil companies today, you will find that they're all in some way or other trying to deal with the change that they have to go through. Some of them are more convincing than others. I had a quick look at just 3 companies when I was thinking about this, and one of them was, I would call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. In actual fact, a good one, a good company which is involved in the downstream sector, Scottish and Southern Energy, fairly recently published its just transition strategy, and this outlines the principles that underpin how they're going to deal with the social impacts on workers, consumers, communities, and suppliers when they are delivering net zero. And their strategy is framed in two themes. It involves transitioning to new activities new renewable energy type of investments, and also transitioning out at the same time of high carbon operations, such as oil and gas. And in this document, SSE have identified 20 principles for the just transition, covering good, decent, what they call green jobs, building and operating new assets, such as offshore wind, for example, renewable energy assets, supporting people to transition in high carbon jobs, and as I talked about earlier, supporting communities, not only individuals. So I think this company, SSE, have got a very positive approach to it. When you look at big oil in general, they have to say something about how they're doing it. And if you look, I looked at Shell Global, which I would describe as not quite the ugly, but as bad. When you read the document, it's called Shell Global, A Fair and Just Transition. It's quite a large document, but they say they strongly support the Paris Agreement. They tick all the boxes in this document and in their statements. But unfortunately, at the end of it, there's a little section at the end that most people may not read it, but some people would read it. It's called legal disclaimer. And basically in this disclaimer, they're saying, these are only our aims. These plans that we're talking about and these budgets and ideas that we're sharing need to be in step with the movement towards net zero emissions within society and among Shell's customers. So they're basically saying, we would like to do this, but if our customers don't want it, or don't see the need for it, if our investors don't see the need for it, if society is not putting pressure on us, we may not do it. So it's kind of, it looks good on paper, cosmetically speaking, but that's really a get out of jail free card at the end there. The other company that I looked at was Chevron. Everyone knows Chevron. It's a very large US oil and gas, big oil company. Chevron is, I would describe as a prime example, a prime exponent of greenwashing. We know what greenwashing is, I think. It's a play on the term whitewashing, which means using misleading information to gloss over bad behavior. And basically they're countering criticisms of how they operate by using greenwashing. If we look at, for example, some benchmark organizations such as the Climate Action 100 Plus Net Zero Company benchmarks, Chevron meets none of the criteria on that benchmark. Doesn't disclose either an ambition to reach net zero, and doesn't actually say anything about the just transition. The benchmark estimates that over $5.3 billion of Chevron's 2019 capital expenditure is still spent on upstream fossil fuel extraction. And from 2010 to 2020, Chevron have dedicated only 0.2% of their long-term investments to low carbon energy like wind and solar. So really, they are completely avoiding the whole issue. So I think it is fair to call Chevron the ugly. They're really not doing anything about it. They're greenwashing everything.
So the answer, I guess, in a nutshell, is quite a mixed bag of practice between the views of oil companies, some appearing to take it really quite seriously in good faith, and others others not. I wonder, is it how would can you gauge maybe through the trade union movement, which you mentioned, how workers or employees of in the industry or energy industry, or maybe more broadly, how have the employees reacted to the just transition? Would they be embracing it, or perhaps maybe hostile to it, if thinking that the just transition would in fact put them out of a job?
Well, I mean, employees are still not really aware of it in the way that we are discussing it today. I think to really understand this this viewpoint, you have to look at the International Labor Organization, the ILO, which is a UN agency which has been around for a long time, since 1919 of last century. And really, it's an organization that looks after workers, employees. It sets labor standards, it develops policies, promoting decent work for men and women, and covering a wide area of industries and communities, including basic human rights, minimum wages, how industrial relations should be carried out, employment policies, social dialogue, social security, anything that relates to the welfare of their workers, they're on it. So this gives you access to how, perhaps major employers or employers should be doing things. It's basically telling them what would be best practice in how to deal with a just transition. It's a key document, and other issues addressed by the ILO, for example, are policies for skills development. How can workers from an industry which has been a stranded industry or a stranded community, how can they continue to be employed? They can be employed by intervention from governments and other stakeholders to ensure that they support responsive training and capacity building for such employees. They also talk about social protection policies, which would involve, payment of certain amounts to enable workers to get over the transition. Maybe training for a new job. That's not going to happen overnight. It will take a while. So this is another aspect that they're looking at. Active labor market policies, looking at potential communities or sectors before the blow strikes, let's say, before they become unemployed, and how can governments deal with these before it actually happens. The North Sea, again, is worth looking at. A recent study concerning the North Sea oil and gas workers came up, produced a lot of interesting data. Basically, a lot of workers are concerned about their career path, working offshore in the North Sea or onshore, supporting the offshore workers. But many of the reporters, the respondents rather, cited very low morale and fears that their community would become what they call a wasteland region. And in fact, this has already started, partly due to COVID, of course, but when this survey was made in 2020, 43% of oil and gas workers had already been made redundant, in point of fact. And believe it or not, 91% of the respondents in the industry had not even heard of the term just transition. On the other hand, having found out what it was, most of them, 91%, or many of them rather, given the option of retraining to work in other industries or work elsewhere, they were very, very keen on getting into renewables and offshore wind, for example.
Well, thank you. I mean, a very enlightening answer, and whether the companies are remiss, or who is, maybe the governments, we move on to our next question, are remiss or failing to publicize, to promote, indeed to sponsor, the just transition agenda. Do you think that's fair? How are governments across the world promoting it? Or I assume there's a big variety, or some till die in the wool, energy producers, and others perhaps more enlightened or progressive and working away. Could you tell us how governments around the world are promoting just transition?
Well, I think that I would say until relatively recently, not in all cases, but we can definitely see a ratcheting up of focus of governments all over the world on the just transition. That, we might say, has happened, yes, definitely since Paris, 2015, but it's something that is accelerating very rapidly at the moment. For example, we are not a member of the European Union anymore, of course, but the EU itself in 2020 set up a just transition fund, in which they set aside 17.5 billion euros to deal with the just transition. Funding would be available to all member states, and budget for the just transition fund may be complemented with resources from other funds in the EU. And the fund is part of what's known as a just transition mechanism. So I think that we can see that the EU is really onto it, and is budgeting a lot of funding for it. They're definitely, let's say, in the frame regarding the just transition now. Here in Scotland, the Scottish Just Transition Commission started work in 2019 and published several reports, including an interim report in February 2020. And basically, this report recommended how the government could maximize the economic and social opportunities offered by the transition to a net zero economy by 2045, build on Scotland's existing strengths and assets, and understand and mitigate risks related to regional cohesion, equalities, poverty, including fuel poverty, and sustainable and inclusive labor markets. So the Scottish government is quite serious, I would say very serious about it. And they're talking now about skills training and education, job security, more energy efficient homes, building infrastructure and transport and communications for communities which are in the process of change, and making sure that costs don't burden those least able to pay for them. So Scotland is very, very ambitious. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of involvement of trade union labor representatives in the policy yet, but hopefully there will be much more of that, because I think it's quite clear to me anyway that if there's a dialogue going on in just transition, those who are going to be most affected by it should be part of that dialogue. It's not just about talking to industry and talking to politicians and leaders. Talk to the people who are going to be impacted by it. Yes, I mean, the UK, Westminster has come up with the UK net zero strategy. We all know what it's called, Build Back Greener. And again, they seem to be very serious about supporting the development of a skilled, competitive, labor sector through retraining and funding what they call a lifetime skills guarantee, apprenticeships, and so on and so forth. So another very good example, I think, and it's a case study I wish I had more time to spend, examining, was how Canada addressed their transition from coal power to more cleaner energy sources. And again, they set up a just transition task force in 2019, and they actually sent people government representatives into various areas of Canada. Alberta, of course, being the obvious one where the energy industry is most developed. Trying to, really wrestle and come to grips with how these social labor issues should be dealt with. They really grappled with them. It was a really hands-on approach, I think, and it's proved to be quite successful.
Oh, well, I think that's a whole scope for another webinar. I would love to talk about that. I know a little bit about energy policies in Alberta, not because I'm an expert by any means, but just following the press, and the present government had granted some leases for more coal mining in the southern Alberta foothills, and that led to big opposition, and I think they're temporarily suspended. But that's a different subject. I think we've got time for one more question. I wonder, you give us some really excellent examples, and the Canadian one is particularly apt, I guess, from my perspective. Do you want to provide, is there any other specific just transition examples, maybe in specific countries, you can give us to put a bit of flesh on the bones, as it were, for the next few minutes? And then I can see we've had a couple comments we could open up for questions.
Yeah, Paul, another very good example, I think, is Germany. As you probably know, as listeners probably know, the Ruhr, RUHR area of Germany has historically been a major player in Germany's energy landscape, let's say, particularly in the coal industry. And if we look historically, in 1955, for example, 479,000 employees were involved in that industry. By 1980, that had declined to 143,000. And today, there are only about 3,000 people working in the coal industry. So that is a massive change in a major energy industry in Germany. And how was it achieved? Which I think is what you want to know. Instead of a top-down approach, they took what we might call a bottom-up approach, and they talked to the unions directly. I mean, the role of the unions in many continental countries like Germany is very strong and very important. Unlike the UK, where the unions have been seen as, institutions which, how to put it, limit progress and limit change. I think the Germans have got a much more enlightened approach towards it. They're key stakeholders in it, and they're always part of the dialogue. So how did they do it? They provided for early retirement for miners who had worked for at least 20 years and had reached the age of 49, and they gave them a monthly stipend until they qualified for their pensions. Relocated many, many thousands of workers to other jobs in other parts of Germany. Employers committed to transfer workers to other energy jobs within the company, perhaps with retraining and decent pay, and a lot of support for workers transitioning to different sectors. So they were very realistic and very pragmatic about it. And there was no kind of tension between the unions and industry and employers. They looked at it, this was an issue that had to be dealt with by all key stakeholders. Of course, the workers themselves being one of the key ones. So the last major hard coal or black coal mine in Germany actually closed a couple of years ago. So this has been a very successful approach, I think.
It was fascinating. I didn't realize. I knew that had happened, but the sheer scale of it was like 500,000 individuals. So it's a huge workforce, isn't it? Well,
Yeah,
thank you. Sorry, so I'm done. Maybe we'll just come for questions, and you can follow that up. So thank you very much, John, for that.